Hey everybody, this is Bobby Chiu here. I'm a creature designer, illustrator, character designer, and today I want to walk you through the cover of ImagineFX that I painted. So this very first drawing here is done with just a normal ballpoint pen. I believe it's a Bic pen, super cheap, which also means that it can run and it can blot, right? So you want to be really, really careful not to have that happen because, as you know, ink is permanent. So as I'm drawing, many times you'll find me just rolling the pen on another piece of paper or a part of the paper that's really far away. That way, as I'm rolling it, I'm getting the excess ink off of my pen so that there will be no blotting. Let's go to the next step. So here you can see I've kind of redrawn the image from before. Right? This can be very difficult to paint actually because so much of the lighting is already there and I want to change the lighting. I also want to change the drawing a little bit, refine it because you can see it's super small. You can see the size of the pen and then you get a good idea of the size of the drawing. So I refine the drawing and I start to tackle the background. So when I tackle the background, I'm tackling it looking far away, zoomed out, right? And as I shift to my darker tones, I start to shift towards these blues, making it darker. Just by nature, blue is going to be a darker tone. And then the warmer tones, I start to shift towards, more towards yellow, right? Which is also a lighter tone, warmer tone. I just keep things nice and loose, going back and forth to create the basis of my background. Now, this part here, I'm blocking in the character, right? This way, I don't have to worry about painting outside the lines once I have a nice block in. This block in is also very, very loose, very quick. I'm not too concerned about creating a really nice block in right now, but instead, I'm looking for creating a very quick block in so I can add in some quick colors to see if that's what I like and if that's what I want to use to proceed. After that, I start to apply color. And when I start to apply color, I can apply it very, very easily because I have a block in underneath and I could just lock the transparency in Photoshop and just loosely paint over top. I love doing this because then I could get all of these multiple ideas out very, very quickly. And I settled with this one. Now that initial block in, those are not the exact colors that I want. This still very much feels very sketchy. The other thing is that feathers, especially feathers, they are very, very organized, right? It's not going to be as sketchy as this. They're very, very organized and ImagineFX wanted something highly detailed. So that meant that I need to do a lot of cleanup, right? So I took this sketch, I just started painting over top, adding in the colors that I really wanted. And also that gave me an opportunity to fix up the tones a bit as well. Now these feathers look very plain, right? And feathers can have many different patterns, many different features on them. So it's a good idea to study the patterns of feathers, various feathers, and how they also combine. Right? Some feathers will have a certain pattern on one part of the wing, and then the other part of the wing has a different kind of pattern. It's nice to get familiar with these kind of things because then when you're painting imaginary things, these things can just kind of come out of you just through your mental library of feather facts that you've gathered throughout the time. Next, I get into the eyes. Now the eyes, highlights, they are very much a reflection, right? Just like if you saw something that was very reflective, like a mirror, you would see everything super clearly. If you saw something less reflective, like an old penny, you won't see as much of a reflection as you do perhaps notice a highlight. Right? The highlight is the reflection of the light source hitting the surface and bouncing into your eyes. In this case, we're dealing with the eyes. And because the eyes play such a big role in the overall story. I wanted to make sure that I gave it a little bit more emphasis. You could see a slight reflection of the butterfly wings here, influence of that before the highlight. And you could see some greens in here kind of talking about the foliage that's all around as well. Now we get into some fun subsurface scattering. The overall pose and the light direction allowed for some nice subsurface scattering. Now, subsurface scattering is when the light will penetrate through the object, bounce around inside the object a bit, lighting the object up. And so this case, the light is coming and it's hitting the top of the ear. The bottom of the ear is in shadow. So that means that we're seeing the light coming through the top of the ear, through into the fleshy part of the ear, and that's what we're seeing there. Subtleties. A good buddy of mine, Jason Seiler, told me a long time ago, he was like, yeah, it's all in the subtleties. That's what creates believability. He does a lot of very hyper-real portraits and characters and things like that, people-based things. But I took that info and I put it into my creature and fictional creature illustrations. So it's all about those little tiny subtleties. Now, I know we can see these veins quite clearly, but if you zoomed out a whole bunch, you wouldn't really notice them too much unless you looked in there. And then when you did look in there, I love to reward people with more info, right? You looked at my painting for a bit longer, you get a bit more out of it. All right, from here we go to the hair. Now, you might have thought, hey, that looks like hair. That's pretty good. It's done. That's why I love to just zoom in a bit when I think that the hair is done and I do some more. Those little bits, again, it's like the subtleties of things is what will make things feel extra, extra real. Speaking of subtleties, we're getting into transitions of textures, right? In previous images, you did see that I did have these feathers on the side of the head kind of growing out amongst the fur. Now, how does that happen? How does one thing transition into another thing? How does a turtle shell transition into the fleshy parts of the turtle? How does hair begin on a person's head, right? It doesn't just all of a sudden happen. If it was like an exact borderline of this is where hair grows and then this is where hair doesn't grow, that will actually look quite fake a lot of times. A lot of times we can pick out somebody with a wig on because we can see that hairline. It doesn't look real. So in this part, I wanted to think about how does the hair transition from hair into feathers? And you can see that I'm actually creating kind of like these hairs that are shaped into feathers, and then they get more into feathers and more and more and more. But even the further out ones, you can still see little bits of hair at the very end of the feathers. And that can remind you of certain kinds of feathers. Like, for example, I took that inspiration from peacock's feathers, the tail feathers, how they would have these circular kind of patterns, but also they would have a bunch of kind of looser strands of, it looks kind of like hair, you know, can resemble hair. So brought that into the mix. Now in the beginning, you can see that the background, you can see it, all the loose textures, all the loose brush strokes, all that stuff. It's very clear. And that doesn't create as much depth as I'd like. So next step for me was to go up to filter in Photoshop, go to blur, and then Gaussian blur. And then there's a slider there that you can tweak higher or lower and create more of a blur or less of a blur. I like that. So that's what I use to blur out the background. And now I've created some distance between our subject and the background. Now this whole entire image is really all about curiosity and finding our similarities, even though we're so different. Right? This creature is fascinated with this butterfly, and the butterfly is fascinated with the creature because they both can fly. Also, I thought, you know, it'd be nice to create some iridescence. Iridescence really fascinates me. It's like when you see something kind of change colors, change hues as your view changes or the light source changes or the position of the object changes. You can see this a lot of times in insects, like this butterfly. Bubbles, when you're blowing bubbles as a child, you can see some rainbow colors in there. So I thought it'd be nice to have that as being a similarity between the two as well. So you can see some hue shifts in the butterfly wings going into something more magenta. And you can see the creature's hands and legs, they are also hue shifting. We're almost done now, and you can see that the background has been lightened a little bit. It has a little bit of a fog there, right? When you look at before and you look at after, now you can start to see the atmosphere that I'm adding in there. Many times this is something that we forget about as painters, to add in the atmosphere, because we are, especially on clear days, we don't really think about atmosphere at all, but we are living in gas, right? We are living in these particles all over the place. And the more distance that you create, the more that you'll notice the atmosphere, right? When you start to look very much into distance, you can start to see that things have less and less contrast. We especially notice atmosphere on foggy days, right? So I just want to add in a little bit of that. And I also felt like, yeah, that could also be an influence of the camera lens. Just having a little bit of light bleeding in because it's such a sunny day or something like that. And speaking of lenses, also wanted to add in some lens flares and some particles. Another little bit of subtleties that doesn't have to do with the lens per se, but just a nice little touch, some nice little subtleties to give that extra bit of realism. The lens flares, a lot of times we don't really think about the lens that we see the world in. I tend to think about those things, especially when I wake up and I'm rubbing my eyes, I open my eyes, I see these little squiggly, almost lines kind of floating around in my vision, and they go downwards. And I realize that those are little squiggles on my eyeball, parts of liquid, or I don't know, but it just kind of floats around. But that's my lens. That's the lens that I am looking at the world through. Right? And to think about that, now we're getting to some real subtleties. So what kind of lens are we looking through to see this creature? And what are the effects of that, right? So I added in some lens flares to kind of finish it off. In the end, we have this. A little story about two creatures that have found some similarities with each other.